I'm Nora Lancaster, 44, a Navy officer who worked her way up from a military kid with nothing but discipline and drive to earning a star on my shoulder. For years, I held my family together through deployments, moves, long nights, and every sacrifice a uniformed parent makes. But when my ex-husband tried to take our children out of the country and laughed while doing it, I made a decision that rerouted the entire course of our lives. Have you ever been blindsided by someone you poured everything into? Someone who took your loyalty for granted? If that hits close to home, tell me your story in the comments. You're in good company here. Before I dive into what happened, drop where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to draw a hard line after being pushed too far, hit like and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries, strength, and choosing yourself. What came next even I didn't see coming. I grew up in a house where routine meant survival. My father was a Marine gunnery sergeant who believed structure could solve anything, and my mother kept the household running like a well-oiled machine while he deployed. They didn't talk about feelings much, but they showed love through consistency. Dinner at 1800 hours, homework inspected at 1930, lights out at 2100. When I was 12, my father sat me down after finding me organizing my bookshelf by subject and publication date. He didn't laugh. He just nodded and said, "You'd make a good officer someday." I didn't know what that meant yet, but I liked how it sounded, like I could be someone who mattered, someone who made decisions that protected people. The Naval Academy became my target the moment I understood what it was. I studied harder than anyone in my high school, ran track to build endurance, volunteered to show leadership. My parents attended my induction ceremony with quiet pride. My father's chest puffed out just slightly, my mother's eyes wet but her smile steady. Plebe summer broke me down and built me back up. I learned to follow before I could lead, to stay calm when instructors screamed inches from my face, to trust the person next to me even when exhaustion made thinking impossible. I graduated with a commission as an ensign and orders to flight school in Pensacola. The aircraft felt like an extension of my will, responsive, powerful, demanding absolute focus. I loved the precision required, the way a single mistake could cost everything, the responsibility of knowing people's lives depended on my judgment. My first fleet squadron assignment placed me aboard a carrier in the Western Pacific. I flew missions, stood watches, learned from senior officers who'd been doing this since before I was born. I made lieutenant on schedule, then lieutenant commander 3 years later. The promotions came because I worked harder than most and because I genuinely cared about the sailors under my command. I didn't lead from a desk. I walked the flight deck, knew their names, asked about their families, made sure they had what they needed to do their jobs safely. During a port call in San Diego, I met Daniel Morgan at a symposium on aerospace engineering and naval aviation. He worked for a defense contractor, designing components for aircraft I'd flown. He was tall, thoughtful, with an easy smile and genuine curiosity about my work. He asked intelligent questions, listened when I talked, seemed fascinated by the life I'd built. We started dating slowly, coffee when I was in port, phone calls during deployments, emails when communications allowed. He never pressured me to change my schedule or complained when duty called. He said he admired my dedication, that he'd never met anyone so focused and capable. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony at the Naval Academy Chapel. I wore my dress whites. My father stood at attention when I walked down the aisle. Daniel looked at me like I was the only person in the world. We bought a house near North Island, close enough to base that my commute was manageable. Our first child, Emma, arrived when I was a lieutenant commander assigned to a training squadron. I took maternity leave, then returned to duty with a carefully coordinated childcare plan involving Daniel's flexible work-from-home schedule and a reliable daycare provider. Caleb followed 3 years later, just before I pinned on commander. 2 kids, 2 careers, one military lifestyle that demanded constant adaptation. I balanced it all because I had to, coordinating deployments with Daniel's travel, arranging backup care for emergencies, maintaining family routines even when I worked 14-hour days. I handled the finances, scheduled the kids' activities, planned our moves when orders changed, packed and unpacked our lives every few years. Daniel benefited from the structure I created. Our mortgage got paid on time, the kids had stability, our home ran smoothly. He went to work, came home, played with the kids, pursued his hobbies. He didn't see the invisible labor, The constant mental load of managing a household while preparing for inspections, qualifications, and the next deployment. I didn't resent it then. I thought this was just how it worked, that the imbalance would even out once I made captain and the operational tempo decreased. I told myself he was supportive in his own way, that he showed up for the kids even if he didn't show up for the logistics. I protected our bond by not asking for more, by assuming his silence meant contentment rather than entitlement. At night, after the kids were asleep and the house was finally quiet, I'd review readiness reports or study for advancement boards. Daniel would watch television in the next room. We existed in parallel rather than together, but I convinced myself that was normal for a dual-career family. I loved him, or I loved the idea of him, the grounded civilian who balanced my intensity, the father of my children, the man who'd chosen this life with me. I believed the marriage would stabilize once the pressures eased, once I reached a rank where I could control my schedule more, once the kids were older and needed less hands-on parenting. I built my career around that assumption, making sacrifices I thought were temporary, deferring conversations I thought could wait. The truth, though, was already forming in small moments I didn't recognize yet, the way he'd sigh when I mentioned an upcoming deployment, the way he'd make jokes about my uniform at social gatherings, the way he'd describe our life to friends as if he were enduring it rather than choosing it. I missed those signs because I was too busy keeping everything running, too focused on the next mission, too invested in believing we were building something together. But the fracture lines were already there, invisible but deepening, waiting for the right pressure to split everything open. The promotion to commander came with a ceremony I'd worked toward for years. My parents flew in, the kids wore their best clothes, Daniel stood in the audience looking distracted. Afterward, at the reception, he made polite conversation, but left early, citing work deadlines. I stayed, shaking hands with senior officers, accepting congratulations from subordinates, feeling proud and strangely hollow at the same time. That's when the shift started, not dramatic at first, just a subtle change in temperature. Daniel became defensive about my schedule, irritated when I had to work late or take calls at home. He started making comments about normal families who ate dinner together every night, who didn't move every few years, who had predictable routines. He'd say it casually, like an observation rather than an accusation, but the implication was clear. Our lifestyle was my fault, my choice, my burden he'd been forced to carry. He began rewriting history in small ways. At a backyard barbecue with neighbors, he mentioned he'd always been the one keeping this family together while I was deployed. It wasn't true. I'd arranged every detail of their care before leaving, maintained contact throughout, ensured stability from thousands of miles away. But he said it with such conviction that I wondered if he actually believed it. He acted entitled to my time while offering little of his own. When I asked him to handle school pickups during a particularly intense inspection cycle, he sighed like I'd requested something unreasonable. When I suggested we split the mental load of managing the household, he looked at me blankly, as if he didn't understand what I meant. His new social circle at work reinforced these attitudes. He started spending more time with colleagues who talked about freedom and living spontaneously and escaping responsibility. They were younger, mostly single or divorced, living lives unconstrained by children or military commitments. Daniel would come home from happy hours talking about their adventures, last-minute road trips, spontaneous concerts, weekends spent doing absolutely nothing. He described these things wistfully, as if mourning a life he'd never actually had. His jokes about living with an officer stopped being funny. He'd make them at dinner parties in front of friends, with a tone that suggested he was the victim of circumstances beyond his control. People would laugh uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. I'd smile tightly, changing the subject, protecting his dignity even as he undermined mine. Respect eroded in increments too small to confront individually but too consistent to ignore. He'd dismiss my concerns about the kids' schooling, then make unilateral decisions without consulting me. He'd interrupt me during conversations, talk over me when I tried to explain Navy policies he didn't understand. He stopped asking about my work entirely, as if my career were a hobby rather than a calling that defined my identity. The tension tightened gradually, like a cable under increasing strain. I'd come home exhausted from a 14-hour day to find him relaxed on the couch, the kitchen a mess, the kids needing help with homework. He'd look up surprised, as if my arrival were unexpected, as if he hadn't been responsible for them all day. I'd swallow my frustration, clean the kitchen, help with homework, get the kids to bed, then collapse with barely enough energy to shower. During rare quiet moments, I'd try to talk to him about the imbalance, about my need for partnership rather than parallel existence. He'd nod, agree we should work on it, then change nothing. Or he'd turn it around, suggesting I was too controlling, too rigid, too unwilling to relax and let things unfold naturally. I started to doubt myself, wondering if my military training made me unreasonable, if my expectations were too high, if I was manufacturing problems that didn't exist. But late at night, reviewing the patterns, I knew something fundamental had shifted. Daniel had stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as an obstacle to the life he'd convinced himself he deserved. The marriage wasn't breaking suddenly, it was eroding steadily, day by day, conversation by conversation, dismissed concern by dismissed concern. I still believed we could fix it if we tried, if we went to counseling, if we found a way to reconnect. I suggested therapy. He said we didn't need it, that we just needed to get through this phase. I suggested a weekend away, just the two of us. He said he couldn't take time off work. I suggested small changes, more communication, shared responsibilities, intentional time together. He agreed in principle but resisted in practice, finding reasons why this week wasn't good, why next month would be better, why we should wait until things calmed down. Things never calmed down. That's not how military life works. There's always another inspection, another deployment, another crisis requiring attention. I'd learned to thrive in that environment, to find stability within constant change. Daniel, I realized, had been waiting for the change to stop, for life to settle into the comfortable routine he'd imagined when we married. He'd been waiting for me to become someone else, someone less demanding, less dedicated, less committed to the uniform I wore. And when I didn't transform into that person, when I continued advancing and accepting greater responsibilities, he decided the problem was me rather than his expectations. The separation papers arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was preparing for a change of command ceremony. Daniel had filed without warning, without conversation, without attempting one final effort to save what we'd built. The petition cited irreconcilable differences and painted my service as the primary obstacle to a healthy marriage. His attorney requested joint custody with a schedule that assumed I could rearrange my career around his convenience. I read the documents twice, absorbing the language that reframed 15 years of partnership as my failure. The ceremony went forward as planned. I transferred command with the same precision I brought to everything, my voice steady, my bearing professional. Afterward, colleagues congratulated me, unaware that my marriage had just imploded in the most passive-aggressive way possible. The custody negotiations turned combative quickly. Daniel wanted arrangements he hadn't earned through participation, equal time despite years of minimal involvement, decision-making authority he'd never exercised, flexibility I'd never received. His attorney painted me as a workaholic who prioritized career over children, ignoring that I'd built every routine, attended every parent-teacher conference possible, maintained stability through multiple deployments and moves. My attorney countered with documentation, calendars showing my involvement, emails demonstrating my planning, testimony from childcare providers about who actually managed the children's lives. Eventually, an agreement formed, shared custody with accommodations for my deployment schedule, joint decision-making on major issues, a framework that looked reasonable on paper but felt like defeat in practice. 2 months later, I pinned on Captain. The promotion represented decades of work, sacrifice, and dedication. My parents attended the ceremony with pride. The kids seemed to understand the significance, standing straighter when I walked into the room wearing the eagles on my shoulders for the first time. Daniel sent a text, "Congrats." That was it. No acknowledgement of what this milestone meant, no recognition of the journey it represented, no celebration of an achievement we'd once shared as partners. The betrayal arrived on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was in my office reviewing personnel evaluations when my phone rang. Daniel's number appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer. We'd agreed to communicate primarily through text to avoid conflict. But something made me pick up. Background noise hit me first. Airport announcements, the mechanical voice calling boarding groups, the ambient chaos of a terminal. Then his voice, casual and triumphant. I'm taking the kids to Brazil. He said it like he was announcing a vacation, like this was a normal conversation between co-parents discussing travel plans. What are you talking about? I kept my voice level, professional, already running through protocols in my mind. There's nothing you can do about it. He laughed, actually laughed. I've got tickets, I've got passports, and I've got them right here. We're boarding in 20 minutes. I heard Emma's voice in the background asking when they'd be home. She sounded confused, not scared yet, unaware that her father was attempting to remove her from the country without permission, without a custody agreement that allowed international travel, without any regard for the law or her well-being. Daniel, you need to bring them home right now. This is parental kidnapping. It's not kidnapping when it's their father taking them on vacation. You're always working anyway. They'll be better off with me. His tone had shifted from triumphant to defensive, revealing the rationalization he'd built to justify this. My mind became absolutely still, the way it did during emergency procedures when chaos required calm. I thought about my children on that plane, confused and vulnerable. I thought about international jurisdictional complications, about how difficult recovery would be once they left U.S. airspace. I thought about Daniel's entitlement, his willingness to traumatize our children to punish me. The decision formed instantly, clearly, without doubt. I ended the call. I pulled up my contact list and made one phone call to the installation commander at the nearest air station. My voice was steady, authoritative, carrying the weight of the rank I'd earned. This is Captain Nora Lancaster. I need to report an in-progress parental abduction at Commercial Airport Terminal. 2 minor children, U.S. citizens, being removed from the country without legal custody permission. I'm requesting immediate coordination with airport security and law enforcement to ground the aircraft and remove the passengers. The protocols activated exactly as designed. Authority flowed through the system. Installation commander to airport liaison to TSA to gate security. Within 6 minutes, every departure from that terminal was temporarily suspended pending security verification. Daniel sat on that aircraft feeling smug, probably rehearsing what he'd tell the kids about their big adventure, imagining my helpless frustration when I discovered they were gone. He didn't understand that the authority I carried wasn't theoretical. It was real, immediate, and backed by systems designed to respond to exactly this kind of threat. The SWAT team boarded his plane 12 minutes after my call. Passengers were asked to remain seated while law enforcement removed 3 individuals for questioning. Emma told me later that her father's face went white when the officers approached, that he'd stammered something about a misunderstanding, that he looked genuinely shocked when they escorted him off the aircraft in front of everyone. The children were brought to me within the hour. Emma looked shaken but composed, holding Caleb's hand tightly. Caleb seemed confused more than frightened, asking if they were still going on vacation. I knelt down to their level, keeping my voice calm and reassuring. There's been a change of plans. Dad made a mistake. You're safe now and we're going home. Emma's eyes searched mine for truth, for stability, for confirmation that the world still made sense. I gave her that certainty through my steady gaze, my unhurried movements, my refusal to show panic or anger in front of them. Daniel was detained by airport police and transferred to federal custody for attempted international parental kidnapping. The charges were serious: potential felony conviction, loss of custody rights, possible prison time. His attorney called me that evening, suggesting we could work this out if I dropped the charges. I declined politely but firmly. This wasn't something you worked out. This was a crime against our children, a violation of trust so profound that no explanation could excuse it. I spent the evening with Emma and Caleb, maintaining normal routines: dinner, homework help, bedtime stories. They needed consistency more than explanations, stability more than details about what their father had tried to do. Later that night, after they were asleep, Commander Elena Brooks came to the house. Elena and I had served together on 2 previous assignments. She understood both the personal and institutional gravity of what had happened. We sat in my kitchen drinking coffee while I debriefed the day's events with the same thoroughness I'd use for a tactical operation. You did the right thing, Elena said quietly. Some people will question it, but you protected your kids. I keep running through alternative scenarios. What if I tried to negotiate with him? What if I'd let him think he was winning and then pursued legal channels? He would have been in Brazil with your children. Recovery would have taken months, maybe years. You made the call that kept them safe. I thought about the years of imbalance leading to this moment, my constant sacrifice, his growing resentment, the slow erosion of partnership into adversarial positions. I'd made so many accommodations, swallowed so many frustrations, given so much benefit of the doubt. And still, Daniel had convinced himself he was the victim, that taking our children to another country was justified revenge for slights that existed only in his imagination. I reviewed the decisions I'd made throughout our marriage, the times I'd minimized his disrespect to keep peace, the conversations I'd avoided to prevent conflict, the warning signs I'd rationalized away because confronting them would have meant admitting the marriage was failing. Each choice had seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they'd enabled Daniel's escalating sense of entitlement. I should have seen this coming, I said. You saw a struggling marriage. You couldn't have predicted he'd attempt kidnapping. Those are different categories of dysfunction. Elena was right, but the guilt persisted anyway. I'd been trained to anticipate threats, assess risks, implement preventive measures. Somehow I'd applied that rigor to my professional life while giving my personal life far too much latitude for deterioration. I recognized now that Daniel's act was about control, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim power in a relationship where he'd felt diminished. He'd convinced himself that my success diminished his worth, that my rank made him less of a man, that his only path to significance was tearing down what I'd built. The authority I'd exercised wasn't over him, it was for Emma and Caleb. Every protocol I'd activated, every call I'd made, every decision in those critical 12 minutes had been about protecting children from a parent whose judgment had become dangerously compromised. I couldn't protect them by minimizing someone else's instability. I couldn't keep them safe by pretending Daniel's resentment was manageable or that his escalating entitlement would resolve itself. I had to acknowledge reality clearly and act decisively, the same way I would in any crisis situation. The truth settled uncomfortably. Sometimes protecting people you love means using every tool available, even when those tools feel disproportionate, even when using them will be criticized, even when it means permanently severing relationships that can't be salvaged. Elena left around midnight. I sat alone in the quiet house, thinking about the next steps, emergency custody hearings, legal proceedings, trauma counseling for the kids. The list was long and daunting, but I'd faced daunting before. This time, though, the stakes weren't theoretical. They weren't about mission success or operational readiness. They were about two children who needed me to be absolutely certain, absolutely steady, absolutely committed to their safety above all other considerations. I checked on Emma and Caleb one final time before bed. They were sleeping peacefully, unaware of the legal machinery already in motion to ensure they'd never face this danger again. I stood in their doorway for a long moment, watching them breathe, reminding myself why every difficult decision ahead would be worth it. I filed for emergency sole custody the following morning, supported by documentation of Daniel's attempted abduction and law enforcement reports from the airport incident. The judge granted a temporary order within 48 hours, removing Daniel's custodial rights pending a full hearing and restricting his contact to supervised visitation only. My attorney warned me this would provoke a reaction. She was right. The voicemails started immediately, Daniel calling me vindictive, accusing me of overreacting, claiming he'd only wanted quality time with his children. The messages oscillated between anger and self-pity, never once acknowledging that he'd attempted to remove our children from the country illegally. His version of events had no room for his actions, only for my response, which he characterized as excessive and cruel. The emails followed a similar pattern. Long paragraphs about how I'd weaponized my rank, how I'd humiliated him publicly, how I'd destroyed his relationship with his children. He positioned himself as the victim of my military authority rather than the perpetrator of a serious crime. He tried guilt next, sending messages about how much the kids needed their father, how damaging this separation would be, how I was punishing them to hurt him. He CC'd extended family members on some emails, creating external pressure for me to be reasonable and think about what's best for the children. Several relatives called, suggesting I was being too harsh, that Daniel had made a mistake but meant well, that family should forgive and move forward. They didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, that this wasn't about forgiveness. This was about safety and accountability. Even Daniel's attorney hinted at optics during a phone call, suggesting that a Navy captain aggressively pursuing charges against a civilian father might not look good for my career. The implication was clear: soften my position to protect my professional reputation. I held the line. I stated the facts calmly, repeatedly, to anyone who questioned my decisions. Daniel had attempted to take our children to Brazil without permission, without legal authority, and without regard for custody arrangements. That wasn't a mistake. That was a calculated act that required planning, deception, and willingness to traumatize his own children. I would pursue full custody because his judgment had proven dangerously compromised. I would support criminal prosecution because attempted parental kidnapping was a serious crime with serious consequences. I would not minimize what happened to make other people comfortable or to preserve a relationship that had become harmful. Daniel's confidence began cracking when he realized the consequences wouldn't disappear through manipulation or pressure. His attorney withdrew from the case after the preliminary hearing, unwilling to defend actions that were indefensible. His employer placed him on administrative leave following his arrest. Friends began distancing themselves once they understood what he'd actually done rather than his version of events. The full custody hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. In the interim, Daniel was allowed one supervised visit per week at a family services center. He attended the first visit, but spent most of it trying to convince the supervisor that I'd overreacted, that this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Emma reported that he'd asked her to tell the judge she wanted to live with him, that he'd tried to coach her on what to say. The supervisor documented everything. At night, after the kids were in bed, I reviewed case files and prepared for testimony. My attorney had warned this would be difficult. Daniel's lawyer would try to paint me as an absent workaholic who'd used my position to punish a father seeking connection with his children. We prepared counterarguments, detailed records of my involvement, documentation of Daniel's minimal participation over the years, testimony from teachers and childcare providers about who'd actually raised these kids. But beyond strategy and evidence, I kept returning to a simpler truth. I would not compromise my children's safety to avoid being called difficult. I would not minimize danger to preserve appearances. I would not apologize for using every resource available to protect two vulnerable people from someone whose entitlement had overcome his judgment. The external pressure continued: concerned emails from acquaintances, suggestions that I was being too military about a civilian family matter, implications that real mothers would find a way to forgive and reunify. I stopped responding to most of it. The people who mattered, Elena, my parents, my closest colleagues, understood exactly what I was doing and why. Everyone else could think whatever they needed to think. Daniel made one final attempt at manipulation before the hearing, a long letter delivered through his new attorney, describing his regret and asking for another chance. The letter was carefully worded, probably written by the lawyer, designed to sound contrite without actually accepting responsibility. It talked about poor judgment and stress-induced decisions, but never acknowledged the terror he'd caused or the trust he'd destroyed. I read it once, then filed it with the other evidence. Words without corresponding changed behavior meant nothing. Actions demonstrated truth. And Daniel's actions had shown me exactly who he was when he didn't get what he wanted. Daniel's world began unraveling in ways I observed from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with detached clarity. The criminal case moved forward despite his attorney's attempts to negotiate a plea deal. The prosecutor wasn't interested in leniency. Attempted international parental kidnapping was too serious, too calculated, too clearly premeditated to dismiss as a moment of poor judgment. Financial pressure mounted quickly. Legal fees consumed his savings. The administrative leave from work became an unprofessional conduct investigation when his employer learned the full details of his arrest. His social circle fractured as people realized his version of events bore little resemblance to reality. Professional embarrassment followed. Word spread through aerospace engineering circles that he'd been arrested at an airport trying to flee the country with his children. The industry was smaller than people realized, reputations traveled fast, and his had become toxic. Job applications went unanswered. Networking contacts stopped returning calls. The career he'd built over 2 decades began contracting as doors closed quietly but decisively. The custody hearing proceeded without drama. My attorney presented comprehensive evidence, my consistent involvement despite military commitments, Daniel's minimal participation over the years, detailed documentation of the airport incident, psychological evaluations raising concerns about his judgment and impulse control. Daniel's new attorney tried to argue that one incident shouldn't define years of fatherhood, but the judge wasn't persuaded. She granted me full legal and physical custody, with Daniel receiving supervised visitation contingent on completing parenting classes and psychological counseling. He lost more than custody. He lost the narrative he'd built about himself as the stable parent victimized by my career. For the first time, Daniel experienced real consequences without me buffering them. Throughout our marriage, I'd managed fallout from his mistakes, smoothing over social conflicts, covering financial shortfalls from his impulsive purchases, explaining away his absences to the kids. I'd protected him from the natural results of his choices because that's what partners did, or so I'd believed. Without that protection, reality arrived swiftly and comprehensively. My home stabilized in the weeks following the hearing. Emma and Caleb settled into consistent routines: school, activities, dinner at 1800 hours, homework, bedtime. The predictability they'd always had returned, but without the underlying tension of Daniel's presence disrupting it. I arranged therapy for both children with a counselor who specialized in family trauma. Emma talked about feeling confused at the airport, about not understanding why her father had lied about where they were going. Caleb mostly drew pictures during sessions, but gradually began expressing that he felt safer now. I watched Daniel's unraveling from necessary distance, maintaining boundaries while ensuring the kids had what they needed. His supervised visits became sporadic. He'd miss scheduled times, then send desperate emails asking for makeup sessions. His behavior during visits remained problematic, trying to undermine my authority, making promises he couldn't keep, using his limited time to complain about consequences rather than connect with his children. The supervisor's reports documented everything, creating a record that would influence future custody decisions. My own transformation was internal, but profound. I stopped apologizing for my career in conversations with civilians who questioned how I balance motherhood with military service. The question itself revealed assumptions I no longer felt obligated to address, as if fathers were never asked how they balanced fatherhood with demanding jobs, as if my dedication to both roles required justification theirs didn't. I stopped shrinking to maintain peace. In meetings, I stated my positions clearly without softening them to avoid seeming too aggressive. With the kids, I enforced boundaries without excessive explanation or guilt. In my personal life, I said no to obligations that drained energy without providing value. I accepted leadership at home the same way I accepted it at work, not as something to apologize for, but as something that protected people who depended on me. The structure of my life felt steady for the first time in years, not despite the chaos of separation and custody battles, but because I'd finally stopped enabling dysfunction. Daniel had thrived on my willingness to manage his emotional volatility, to absorb his resentment, to make space for his version of reality even when it contradicted objective facts. Without that accommodation, his carefully constructed narrative collapsed under the weight of his own choices. Friends occasionally asked if I felt guilty about how completely his life had deteriorated. The question annoyed me more than it should have, as if his consequences were my responsibility, as if I'd forced him to attempt kidnapping rather than simply responded to it. I didn't cause his problems. I just stopped preventing them. For once, the structure of my life wasn't about maintaining something fragile and unstable. It was about building something solid enough to withstand pressure, clear enough to navigate confidently, strong enough to protect the people who actually mattered. Daniel's apologies, when they finally came, revealed everything about who he remained rather than who he'd become. The first arrived via email 6 weeks after the custody hearing. I just wanted a fresh start somewhere we could all be happy. I never meant to hurt anyone. The words sounded reasonable until you examined them closely. A fresh start required destroying the life we'd built without consulting the other people affected. Happiness in his formulation meant removing our children from everything familiar and depositing them in a country where they didn't speak the language, didn't know anyone, had no support system. His intentions mattered more to him than their well-being. He never meant to hurt anyone, but he'd been willing to terrify them in service of what he wanted. The second apology came through his attorney. Daniel acknowledges his actions were inappropriate and hopes to rebuild trust through consistent, appropriate contact with the children. Legal language stripped of actual accountability. His actions were worse than inappropriate, they were criminal. And rebuilding trust required understanding why it had been destroyed, which his carefully worded statement avoided entirely. I maintained strict boundaries that formalized what had become necessary. Written communication only, no phone calls unless pre-approved by the family services supervisor, supervised visitation with 48-hour advance notice, no travel outside the county without court permission. Daniel chafed against these restrictions, calling them punitive and excessive, but they weren't punishment, they were protection. His judgment had proven unreliable. The boundaries reflected that reality. The kids stopped asking when they'd see their father unsupervised. Emma, perceptive and emotionally intelligent beyond her years, had figured out that the supervised visits existed for a reason. She was polite during them but guarded, watching her father carefully, maintaining emotional distance. Caleb followed his sister's lead, engaging when Daniel tried but not seeking connection the way he once had. The trust one rebuilt wasn't with Daniel, it couldn't be. Trust required reliability, honesty, and demonstrated change over time. He'd shown none of those things. The trust one rebuilt was with myself, recognizing warning signs earlier, setting boundaries sooner, believing my own assessment of situations rather than deferring to someone else's version of events. I'd spent years doubting my perceptions, wondering if I was too rigid, too demanding, too unwilling to accept imperfection. Daniel had encouraged those doubts, suggesting my military training made me unreasonable, that I created problems that didn't exist. The airport incident had clarified everything. My instincts had been right all along. I just hadn't trusted them enough to act. The kids settled into their new rhythm with surprising resilience. Emma joined the debate team at school and discovered she loved structured argumentation. Caleb started playing soccer and thrived on the teamwork and clear rules. They asked fewer anxious questions about schedules, about where they'd be living, about whether plans would suddenly change. Stability became our default again, not something we hoped for, but something we lived. Daniel's attempts at contact continued sporadically, each one revealing his unchanged mindset. He'd send gifts without coordinating through proper channels, forcing me to return them. He'd show up at the kids' school events unannounced, requiring staff to enforce the custody order. He'd post vague messages on social media about fighting for his children, performing victimhood for an audience that didn't know the full story. I stopped engaging with any of it. I'd learned that responding gave him what he wanted: attention, reaction, evidence that he still affected me. Instead, I documented everything and let the family court system handle violations. My energy belonged with my children, my career, and my own healing, not managing someone else's refusal to accept consequences. Months passed. The supervised visits decreased in frequency as Daniel's interest waned when he realized the restrictions wouldn't lift quickly. His new attorney filed a motion to modify custody arrangements, arguing he'd completed recommended counseling and demonstrated changed behavior. The motion was denied. 6 therapy sessions and 3 months of sporadic compliance didn't override attempted kidnapping or establish genuine transformation. At night, after Emma and Caleb were asleep, I'd sometimes think about the marriage I'd wanted versus the reality I'd lived. I'd imagined partnership, mutual support, shared commitment to building something meaningful together. Daniel had wanted stability without responsibility, the benefits of my structure without contributing to it, the appearance of family without the actual work required. I'd given years trying to bridge that gap, assuming effort and patience would eventually align our visions. The real lesson was simpler and harder. Some gaps can't be bridged. Some people won't change because they don't believe they need to. Some relationships survive only as long as one person accepts less than they deserve. I'd finally stopped accepting it. And everything improved the moment I did. Time moved forward with the steady rhythm I'd always preferred but rarely achieved. Months accumulated into a year, then longer, each one layered with small victories that built into something sustainable. The kids laughed more easily, their anxiety about sudden changes fading as consistency proved reliable. Emma started bringing friends home after school without asking permission first, a small thing, but it meant she trusted that our home was stable enough to share. Caleb stopped asking if we were moving soon, stopped checking if plans would change at the last minute. Life developed patterns they could count on. My career trajectory continued on schedule. The promotion board for Rear Admiral Lower Half convened in early spring. The selection process was rigorous, competitive, evaluating not just performance, but leadership philosophy, strategic thinking, and sustained excellence over decades. I'd prepared thoroughly, knowing that making flag rank required demonstrating capabilities beyond operational expertise. When the results were announced, my name appeared on the list. The ceremony took place on a clear morning at Naval Base San Diego, with full honors and representatives from commands I'd served throughout my career. Emma and Caleb stood in the front row, both wearing outfits they'd chosen themselves, both standing straighter than usual. My parents attended, my father's chest puffed with pride, my mother's eyes wet but her smile steady, the same expressions they'd worn at my academy induction 26 years earlier. Elena Brooks read the orders. My new stars were pinned to my shoulders by the commander of the Pacific Fleet, a 4-star admiral I'd worked with years earlier during a joint task force assignment. The weight was minimal physically, but significant symbolically. The children understood what the ceremony meant, or at least they understood it mattered. Emma asked intelligent questions about what admirals did, about how many people were in the Navy, about whether I'd have to deploy more or less now. Caleb mostly wanted to know if he could touch the stars. I let him hold one afterward, watching his careful fingers trace the silver points. Daniel wasn't there. He'd stopped attending events involving the kids months earlier, finding excuses when supervised visits were scheduled, gradually fading from their lives in ways that were sad but also stabilizing. His absence no longer created tension. It created space for the kids to exist without navigating his moods or expectations. Life recalibrated around that absence, filling in the gaps with healthier relationships and clearer boundaries. I reclaimed parts of myself that had been buried under conflict and compromise. Morning runs became routine again, 30 minutes at 0600 hours, the rhythm clearing my mind before the day's demands began. Cooking returned as something enjoyable rather than obligatory, experimenting with recipes while the kids did homework at the kitchen table. Quiet evenings without tension felt like gifts rather than expectations, time expanding to include reading, conversation, occasional hobbies I'd shelved during the marriage years. Small pleasures accumulated, coffee on the back deck before dawn, listening to music without needing to accommodate anyone else's preferences, making plans without coordinating through someone else's resistance. I'd forgotten what it felt like to live without constant negotiation, without managing someone else's resentment, without trying to maintain peace at the cost of my own clarity. The realization arrived gradually rather than dramatically. The real turning point hadn't been grounding the airport or winning custody or even divorcing Daniel. The turning point had been recognizing my own steadiness, understanding that my judgment was sound, my priorities were right, my commitments were worthy of protection. I hadn't acted out of revenge that day at the airport. I'd acted out of duty, the same duty I brought to every command, every decision, every moment when someone vulnerable needed protection from harm. The authority I'd exercised wasn't about power over Daniel. It was about responsibility for Emma and Caleb, about using every resource available to keep them safe when their safety was threatened. That clarity changed everything. It meant I could trust myself in ways I'd doubted before. It meant the structure I built my life around wasn't excessive or rigid. It was exactly what was needed. It meant choosing the life that kept me safe, that kept my children safe, wasn't selfish, it was essential. A year after pinning on my first star, I stood on the deck of a guided missile destroyer during a change of command ceremony for one of my former subordinates. She'd served under me as a lieutenant junior grade, and now she was taking command of her own ship. During her speech, she mentioned that I'd taught her leadership means staying calm when everyone else is panicking and having the courage to make hard calls when easier options exist. I recognized the lesson. I'd lived it repeatedly, most dramatically that Thursday afternoon when Daniel called from the airport. Staying calm hadn't meant being passive. Having courage didn't mean choosing the nuclear option reflexively. It meant assessing the situation clearly, understanding what was at stake, and acting decisively to protect what mattered most. The marriage ended. The custody battle concluded. The legal consequences played out according to law and evidence. But the real victory was internal, reclaiming my own voice, trusting my own judgment, building a life that reflected my values rather than someone else's comfort. For the first time in years, my life felt open instead of reactive, expansive instead of constrained. I woke up each morning without dread, went to work without the weight of managing dysfunction at home, returned to a house that felt peaceful rather than tense. The kids thrived in that environment. I thrived in it. Understanding settled gently, without fanfare. I hadn't just walked away from Daniel. I'd walked back toward myself, toward the person I'd been before compromise became confusion, before accommodation became self-doubt, before partnership became self-sacrifice. That person was steady, capable, clear-eyed about threats and opportunities alike. She protected people who depended on her. She used authority responsibly but decisively. She refused to minimize danger or enable dysfunction, even when doing so would have been easier, more comfortable, more socially acceptable. She chose safety over approval. And she'd finally learned what healing looked like when the danger was gone. Not dramatic transformation, not sudden enlightenment, just steady days accumulating into a life worth protecting, worth building, worth living fully without apology. 25 years later, I stood in my study at 0530 hours, watching dawn break over the Pacific through floor-to-ceiling windows. The house was different now, a smaller place in Coronado I'd purchased after retirement, close enough to the ocean that I could hear waves when the windows were open. My uniform hung in the closet untouched except for ceremonial occasions. The weight of command had lifted years ago, replaced by something quieter but no less purposeful. I'd retired as a vice admiral after 38 years of service. The final ceremony had been dignified, attended by officers I'd mentored, sailors I'd led, colleagues who'd become lifelong friends. Emma and Caleb had stood beside me, both adults now, both understanding in ways they couldn't have as children what those 3 stars represented. The Navy had given me structure, purpose, and identity. Leaving it had required learning who I was without the uniform, a process more challenging than any deployment. Emma was 36 now, a federal prosecutor in San Diego specializing in family law and child protection cases. She'd gone to law school with clear purpose, telling me during her first year that watching me navigate the custody battle had shown her how legal systems could protect vulnerable people when used correctly. Her work was demanding, sometimes heartbreaking, always meaningful. She'd married another attorney 3 years ago, a thoughtful man named Marcus, who treated her as an equal partner and whose respect for her career was absolute. They had one daughter, Sophia, age 2, a bright-eyed toddler who called me Admiral Grandma because Emma had taught her early. Caleb was 33, a Navy helicopter pilot currently serving as a lieutenant commander stationed at North Island. He'd surprised me by choosing military service after swearing throughout high school he'd never wear a uniform. But something had shifted during college, maybe watching me prepare for retirement, maybe processing childhood experiences through an adult lens, maybe simply finding his own path that happened to parallel mine. He flew search and rescue missions with precision and calm that reminded me of my younger self. He'd never married, claiming his rotation schedule made relationships complicated, though I suspected he was simply selective about who he let close. Daniel had died 4 years ago. Heart attack at 69, sudden and unexpected. Emma had called to tell me, her voice neutral, unsure how I'd react. I'd felt a complicated mixture of emotions, sadness for the person he'd been before resentment consumed him, relief that the lingering anxiety about his presence had a definitive end, regret that he'd never found whatever he'd been searching for when he tried to take our children to Brazil. The kids had attended his funeral out of obligation more than grief. Their relationship with him had remained distant and formal until the end. Supervised visits had eventually become unsupervised, but trust never fully rebuilt. He'd remarried briefly in his 60s, divorced again, lived alone in Arizona working consulting jobs that never quite materialized into stability. I didn't celebrate his death, but I didn't mourn it either. He'd become largely irrelevant to our lives years before his passing. The threat he'd posed had dissipated through legal boundaries and time. What remained was a cautionary memory about recognizing dysfunction early and acting decisively when safety was at stake. My mornings now followed a different rhythm than military life had demanded. I still woke early. Decades of training made sleeping past 0600 impossible, but the structure served my preferences rather than duty requirements. I ran along the beach for 45 minutes, the ocean constant and calming. I returned home, showered, made coffee, and spent an hour reading before the rest of the day began. Some mornings I read history or biography. Other mornings I reviewed case files for the work that had filled my retirement years. I'd started consulting for the Department of Defense on issues involving military family law, parental rights during deployment, and custody arrangements for service members. The work drew directly from my experience, both professional expertise and personal history. I helped draft policy recommendations, testified before congressional committees, advised JAG officers handling complex custody cases. The irony wasn't lost on me. The worst experience of my personal life had become the foundation for helping thousands of service members protect their children and navigate legal systems that didn't always understand military life. I also volunteered with an organization supporting military spouses and children dealing with divorce or custody disputes. 2 evenings a week, I met with people navigating the same chaos I'd survived decades earlier. I didn't offer sympathy, they didn't need that. I offered practical guidance. Document everything, understand your legal rights, don't minimize threats to make other people comfortable, use every resource available to protect your children. Some people bristled at the directness. Most were grateful for clarity in situations where everyone else told them to be accommodating and hope for the best. The phone rang at 07:15, Emma calling during her commute, a routine we'd maintained for years. Morning, Mom. Are we still on for dinner Sunday? 1800 hours, same as always. Is Marcus bringing his famous lasagna? He's threatening to experiment with a new recipe. I told him Sophia's patience for culinary innovation is limited. I smiled. Sophia's patience for anything that isn't goldfish crackers and applesauce is limited. Tell him to stick with the traditional version. Already did. How's the Morrison case coming? The Morrison case involved a Navy lieutenant whose ex-husband had violated custody orders repeatedly, a situation escalating toward potential international parental abduction. I'd been consulting with her attorney, helping develop strategy that balanced legal options with operational realities of military service. We're filing for emergency modifications next week. The judge is skeptical, but the evidence is comprehensive. He's violated the order 4 times in 6 months, each incident more brazen than the last. Sounds familiar. That's why she called me. Her JAG officer knew our history and made the connection. Emma was quiet for a moment. Do you ever regret how public that became? People still reference the airport incident in family law discussions. I considered the question carefully. The airport incident had indeed become a case study, used in legal textbooks, discussed in military law courses, debated in articles about parental rights versus security protocols. My name was attached to it permanently, my decisions analyzed by people who'd never faced similar circumstances. I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret the decision. And if the publicity helps other people understand they have options when their children are threatened, then it serves a purpose beyond our family. That's a very admirable answer. It's a true answer. How's Sophia? Currently obsessed with helicopters because Uncle Caleb showed her videos of his missions. She points at the sky every time she hears rotor noise and yells, "Uncle KK flying." He's created a monster. He's very proud of himself. Speaking of which, is he coming Sunday? He's supposed to be. You know how reliable his schedule is. We talked for another 10 minutes about mundane things, Sophia's developing vocabulary, Marcus's upcoming trial, Emma's caseload. The ordinariness of it felt precious. These weren't conversations shaped by crisis or tension. They were simply a mother and daughter maintaining connection across their separate but intersecting lives. After we hung up, I made breakfast and settled into my study to work on congressional testimony I'd deliver the following month. The hearing focused on updating the Service Members Civil Relief Act to include stronger protections for custody arrangements during deployment. I'd been asked to speak about challenges service members faced when ex-spouses exploited deployments to violate custody orders or relocate children without permission. The testimony was straightforward, supported by data and case examples. But I knew from experience that the most compelling element would be personal narrative, the moment when I'd shift from policy expert to someone who'd lived the consequences of inadequate protections. I'd tell a compressed version of the airport incident, stripped of identifying details but retaining emotional truth. I'd explain how military authority and civilian legal systems sometimes failed to communicate effectively in crisis situations. I'd argue that service members shouldn't have to choose between mission requirements and protecting their children from bad actors. The work was satisfying in ways operational command had never quite been. Leading sailors, managing complex operations, making tactical decisions, all of that had mattered enormously and shaped who I became. But this work felt more personal, more directly connected to preventing the kind of trauma Emma and Caleb had experienced. Every policy improvement, every legal protection, every service member who successfully navigated custody challenges because systems worked better, those were victories measured in stabilized families rather than completed missions. Around 1100 hours, Caleb called. "Hey, Mom. Need a favor." "What kind of favor?" "I'm giving a presentation to junior officers next week about leadership under pressure. I want to include a section on making hard calls quickly. Can I reference the airport thing?" This request came up periodically. Caleb had developed a reputation in his squadron for staying calm during emergencies, for making decisive calls when situations degraded rapidly. He credited watching me navigate crises throughout his childhood, particularly the airport incident that had shaped his understanding of what leadership actually required. You can reference it. Keep the details minimal and focus on the decision-making process rather than the personal drama. That's exactly what I planned. The lesson isn't about family stuff. It's about assessing threats clearly and acting without hesitation when seconds matter. What's the context for the presentation? We had an incident last month during a training exercise. One of the Nuggets froze when his aircraft developed a mechanical issue. Landed safely, but only because his co-pilot took control. He's a good pilot, but he second-guessed himself into paralysis. I want to talk about how training builds confidence for rapid decision-making. The freezing happens when people don't trust their training or their instincts. Usually both. Exactly. And I figure hearing about a situation where someone had about 10 seconds to decide whether to ground an entire airport might help them understand that hesitation costs more than imperfect action. 12 minutes, actually. From his phone call to SWAT boarding the plane. 12 minutes to coordinate airport security, law enforcement, and tactical response across multiple jurisdictions. That's insane, Mom. It's what training and authority enable when systems work correctly. Make sure that's part of your lesson. Individual decisiveness matters, but institutional systems have to support rapid response. We talked through his presentation structure, discussing how to frame leadership lessons without sounding preachy or disconnected from junior officers' experiences. Caleb had grown into a thoughtful leader, someone who understood that authority meant responsibility rather than privilege. Watching him develop those qualities had been one of the unexpected joys of parenthood, seeing your children internalize lessons you'd tried to model, even during chaotic periods when you weren't sure what they were absorbing. Before hanging up, he mentioned he'd probably miss Sunday dinner due to a last-minute flight schedule change. I told him we'd save leftovers. He promised to make the next one. The casualness of it reflected years of learning to accept military life's unpredictability without taking it personally. Emma had struggled with that as a child, Caleb's absences, my deployments, the constant rescheduling. But she'd eventually understood that commitment to service meant accepting disruption as normal rather than exceptional. The afternoon disappeared into emails, document review, and a video call with Lieutenant Morrison's attorney. We discussed strategy, anticipated counterarguments, reviewed evidence chronology. Her ex-husband's violations were well documented, but escalating in concerning patterns, later returns from visitation, vague references to opportunities elsewhere, resistance to communication protocols. The pattern was familiar, nearly identical to Daniel's trajectory before the airport incident. He's testing boundaries, I said. Each violation goes slightly further, seeing what he can get away with. This is pre-abduction behavior. The attorney, a sharp woman in her 40s named Patricia Chin, nodded grimly. That's my assessment too. The question is whether the judge will see it that way or dismiss it as parental conflict. The evidence speaks clearly if presented correctly. Don't frame this as relationship drama. Frame it as systematic disregard for court orders escalating toward a critical incident. Include the research on parental abduction warning signs. Show the pattern isn't random, it's deliberate. We worked through the filing for another hour, refining language, organizing exhibits, anticipating judicial skepticism. This kind of work, granular, strategic, focused on preventing harm before it occurred, felt more valuable than almost anything I'd done during my career. I couldn't deploy forces or command operations anymore, but I could help one lieutenant protect her children from someone whose entitlement was overwhelming his judgment. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my study, looking at the photographs arranged on the built-in shelves. Promotion ceremonies, change of command events, retirement celebration, Emma's law school graduation, Caleb's commissioning, Emma's wedding, Sophia's first birthday. A life documented in formal moments and genuine joy, all of it hard-won through decisions that had sometimes felt impossible, but had ultimately proven necessary. One photograph stood out, Emma and Caleb at ages 11 and 8, taken a few months after the custody battle concluded. They were sitting on the front steps of our old house, Emma's arm around her brother's shoulders, both of them smiling, but with a guardedness in their eyes that spoke to recent trauma. I'd kept the photo as a reminder, not of the pain, but of resilience. Those two children had survived something frightening and destabilizing. They'd come through it stronger, clearer, more capable of recognizing dysfunction and protecting themselves. Emma had prosecuted numerous parental abduction cases during her career. She told me once that she could spot the warning signs instantly, that she understood victim psychology in ways her colleagues didn't because she'd lived it. That knowledge made her better at her job, more empathetic with victims, more aggressive with perpetrators, more strategic about building cases that protected children effectively. Caleb had used the experience differently. He developed a quiet intensity about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. His search and rescue missions weren't just professional obligations, they were personal commitments to ensuring people in danger received help rapidly and competently. He told me after a particularly difficult rescue that he still remembered the SWAT team boarding the plane, still remembered feeling scared, but knowing someone was coming to help. He wanted to be the person who came to help. The airport incident had shaped all of us. It had ended my marriage definitively and publicly. It had traumatized my children in ways that required years of therapy and processing. It had become a case study analyzed by strangers who debated whether I'd overreacted or acted appropriately. But it had also clarified something essential. When people you love are in danger, you use every tool available without apology or hesitation. 25 years of perspective hadn't changed that assessment. If anything, time had reinforced it. I'd seen too many custody cases where people hesitated, tried to be accommodating, gave benefit of the doubt to someone who didn't deserve it, and children paid the price for that hesitation. The Lieutenant Morrison case was heading toward the same crisis her ex-husband's behavior indicated. My advice was simple and direct. Act now, act decisively, document everything, and don't let anyone convince you that protecting your children makes you vindictive. Evening arrived with the soft light that made Coronado beautiful year-round. I made a simple dinner, ate while reading a biography of Admiral Grace Hopper, then took a walk along the beach as the sun set. The ocean was constant, rhythmic, indifferent to human drama in ways I found comforting. Waves had been breaking on the shore before I was born and would continue long after I was gone. My problems, my victories, my decisions, all of it was temporary against that permanence. But temporary didn't mean insignificant. The policies I'd helped shape would protect service members I'd never meet. The lieutenant I was advising would keep her children safe because someone had walked this path before and shared the map. Emma would prosecute cases effectively because she understood what victims needed from the legal system. Caleb would rescue people because he knew what it felt like to need rescuing. Sophia would grow up in a stable home because her mother had learned from experience what healthy relationships required and what red flags demanded immediate action. That ripple effect, decisions made in crisis creating knowledge that protected others years later, felt like the real measure of a life well lived. Not the rank achieved or the ceremonies attended or the accolades received, but the prevented harm, the protected children, the people who were safer because someone had made hard calls and shared what they'd learned. Back home, I checked email one final time and found a message from Patricia Chen. The emergency custody modification had been filed. The judge had scheduled an expedited hearing for the following week and issued a temporary restraining order preventing the ex-husband from traveling with the children pending the hearing. Lieutenant Morrison was relieved, grateful, and terrified about what came next. I wrote back with encouragement and practical advice. Prepare thoroughly, stay calm during testimony, trust that the evidence would speak clearly. I reminded her that using her authority to protect her children wasn't abusive, it was responsible. I told her that people might criticize her for being too aggressive or not giving her ex another chance, and that she should ignore them completely. The only opinions that mattered were the judge's ruling and her children's safety. Before bed, I stood in my study one last time, looking at those photographs again. Vice Admiral Nora Lancaster, retired but not finished. Mother, grandmother, consultant, advocate. Someone who'd made a decision 25 years ago that still reverberated through her life and the lives of people she'd never met. The decision had cost a marriage that was already failing, had created public scrutiny that never fully dissipated, had marked me permanently as that admiral who grounded the airport. But it had kept Emma and Caleb safe. It had shown them that their safety mattered more than appearances or other people's comfort. It had taught them to trust their instincts about danger and to act decisively when action was required. Everything else, the career, the consulting work, the advocacy, the testimony before Congress, all of it flowed from that single moment of clarity when Daniel called from the airport and I understood exactly what needed to happen. I'd made one phone call. 12 minutes later, my children were safe. 25 years later, I'd make the same call without hesitation. That certainty, that absolute clarity about priorities and principles, was the real legacy. Not the stars on my uniform or the policies bearing my input or the cases I'd helped win. The legacy was knowing what mattered, protecting it fiercely, and teaching the next generation to do the same. I turned off the lights and went to bed, the ocean audible through the open window, steady and eternal. Tomorrow would bring more work, more calls from Emma, maybe a text from Caleb, certainly new cases requiring guidance and advocacy. The rhythm would continue, purposeful, structured, meaningful in ways that accumulated slowly, but significantly. I'd walked away from Daniel and walked back toward myself 25 years ago. I was still walking that same path, still choosing safety over approval, still refusing to apologize for decisions that protected people who mattered. And I'd keep walking it until the day I couldn't anymore. And that's how a single phone call changed everything, not just for my kids, but for me. If you've ever had to protect yourself or someone you love when no one else would, I hope this story reminded you that you're stronger than you think. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to set a boundary that shocked someone? Did someone ever underestimate you until the moment you stood your ground? What was your turning point? If this resonated, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Your story matters more than you think.